Do you have a purpose in life? And if you do, what is it? Thomas Carlyle made a great statement when he said, a man without a purpose is like a ship without a rudder. Hi, I'm Pastor Bill with your Maple Minute for this Tuesday, October the 20th, 2020. We've been dealing with the subject for quite some time now about living an intentional life, a life that is God-pleasing, God-honoring. And that's so important because God did create us. And we are on the very last principle that we started last week, the principle of serve God, not self. It's so hard to not serve something other than ourselves because of our sin nature. We naturally gravitate towards our own safety, security, and supremacy, actually. And that means we value us more than we value anything. That's why we put such a high value, especially in the American culture, about how we live. We don't like to suffer at all. That's why the slightest little interruption of our lives can give us such great pain and misery and cause so many problems that if you were in probably a third world country, you probably wouldn't experience as much because they don't have as much to distract them. Last time we talked, though, we looked at a verse that Luke had written over in Acts chapter 13, verse 36. It was a telling verse about David, King David. We know so much about him from the Old Testament. But Luke said this, "Now when David had served God's purpose in his own generation." When it comes to serving, and let me finish the rest of it, I just want to highlight the part I really want to get to. It says he fell asleep or he died and he was buried with his ancestors and his body decayed. But what I want to get to is our point is we're supposed to serve God, not self. David did that. David served God's purpose for his own generation. And last time we talked, we said that there were two observations that we could make from this, that despite his many failures, and David did have quite a few, so we don't want to ever underestimate the fact David was not some kind of supernatural person. He had a supernatural God who did great things through him because he allowed him to. But despite his many failures, David repented and sought God. We talked about that one at length last time. And then today we want to talk about this one. Despite his many failures, David served the purpose of God. He served the purpose of God. You know, as we opened up in this introduction, a man without purpose is like a ship without a rudder. In fact, that's really Rick Warren's whole premise when you get down to the purpose-driven life that he wrote. He starts off that you were designed to worship God. You were designed for a purpose that God created, and that's the whole thing. You are not about you, you're about God. You see, Paul told us this in the book of Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10. He says, "For we are God's handiwork." The Greek word there is poema. Same word we get for poetry, a poem. But it's that masterpiece that it insinuates. We are God's masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus to do good works. And I think we forget, there is a purpose. You weren't put here on this earth just to be put here. God put you here to do specifically some good works. And it says that God prepared in advance for us to do. Before you were ever born, before you were ever thought of, before you ever gleam in your parents' eyes, God had designed you to be His handiwork, His masterpiece to do good works. And He had made those readily available to us. You know, you're not just a random set of DNA strands, as the world would tell you. You're God's work of art, and you're created on purpose. On purpose. You weren't an accident, despite what your parents say. You weren't an whoops, you didn't come at an inopportune time. You were planned for God's purposes. And that's a responsibility statement there that I just made. See, you will never determine your purposes apart from God, and that's why the world struggles so much. Did you get what I just said? Because that's so important. You will never determine your purpose apart from God. Hey, you can have some great hobbies and great things to do, and there's nothing wrong with having any of those things, but your purpose is not your hobby. Music may be your hobby, playing a guitar, playing whatever instrument you like to play. That may be a great thing. Sports may be your hobby. But you know what? You will never determine your purpose in life apart from God. Even atheists know this. This is amazing to me. I came across this one. Atheist Bertrand Russell, he said this, and this is so amazing. He said, "Unless you assume a God, the question of life's purpose is meaningless." And he understands that. And so because we are Christ followers and we assume a God, you should assume a God, the question of life's purpose is not meaningless. We know because we believe in God because we're God's people. And that's one of the roles the atheists have. If I can say there is no God, then I have no purpose here. And there again, I don't have anything to do other than what I want to do. See, that's amazing. And others. I came across, and this is a lengthier quote, I cut down a little bit, but this quote from George Bernard Shaw, who is not a Christ follower either, he said this: "This is the true joy of life." Notice what he's saying. This is a little harder to follow, but he says, "This is the true joy of life, the being," that's us, "the being used of a purpose." And he's telling us once again that everyone has a purpose. "The being used of a purpose, recognized by yourself as a mighty one." And that's what he's saying. Your purposes are so profound to you. And he goes on to say, "The being of a force of nature." Of course, he didn't believe in a divine being as we do, God. He believed sort of in nature. But he says, "The being a force of nature," instead of a feverish, and he's contrasting it here when he says, "Instead of a feverish, selfish little clot of ailments and grievances complaining about the world, it will not devote itself to making you happy." Which, if you think about it, what he's contrasting is this guy who does not believe in God. He's saying, yeah, here you are, you have a purpose in life instead of being what the world is doing to us now, making us that little clot of grievances and complaining it's all about me. You should be here to make me happy. That's the truth. So that leads me to that question. What's your purpose? What or who is your purposes centered on? Is it God's agenda? David served his generation well because he served God's purpose for that generation. Are you doing God's kingdom work? I'm not asking you if you want to be called into ministry. So often we relegate that to the pastor or someone who's full-time in ministry. But you know what? That's not really the truth because we're all called to serve God full-time. His message, Jesus that is, was that he came to seek and to save the lost. So what's keeping you from fulfilling his purposes in your generation? David made his generation a generation that sought after God because David fulfilled his purposes. I think there comes into the life of every person a task for which he or she is uniquely suited. Something that only you can do. And I don't want to say that only you do. If you fail, it would never happen because that gives you too much power. But God has designed you specifically to do something. And when you don't do it, you're not fulfilling the purposes God created you for. You're sort of worthless. It's like buying a car and never driving it, using it as just a showpiece. That's sort of worthless. What a shame it would be if that moment finds us either unwilling or unprepared to do what we could do. As Winston Churchill instructed the British people that they were in their finest hour when they were standing up against the Nazis. What if God put you here as his finest hour for this generation? So, are you seeking God's purposes? And if so, are you serving God's purposes for this generation to make a difference? Because that's the only way we can.